The river at dusk was a living thing, slow, gold-eyed, and patient. Its murmurs carried stories that no one dared to repeat, tales of those who went in heavy-hearted and never rose again. On its quiet edge stood Etta Marlowe, the widow of Siltwater Bend, her black skirts caught in the current like mourning banners. The hem swayed around her legs as if trying to pull her farther in. The air was warm, close, heavy with the scent of silt and willows, and somewhere a whippoorwill called as if to warn her against forgetting the world above the water. She hadn't meant to step so deep. But the river had its way of coaxing surrender, of whispering promises only grief could understand. Beneath the murky surface lay the memory of her husband, his hat, his hand, his breath swallowed whole one spring afternoon when the current turned mean. That was 2 years ago, and the town had long since moved on. The church bells still rang for others, the stores still opened at dawn, and Etta's name was spoken only in lowered tones. She came to the river every evening, when the sun slipped low enough to soften its color to copper. There, no one watched her. No one called her, poor thing, or crossed the street in embarrassment of her loneliness. Here she could let her heart slow to the rhythm of the water. Sometimes she imagined stepping farther until her weight no longer fought the pull. Tonight, that temptation hummed louder than before. Her boot slid on moss-slick stone, and the world upended. The river's mouth closed over her with a soundless gasp. Cold struck her lungs, fierce and sudden. Her skirts tangled, dragging her down. Panic arrived too late to be useful. She thought briefly of nothing but the color green, the kind that turned to black beneath. Then something seized her arm, firm and alive, hauling her upward through the crush of current and light. When she coughed back air, the sky had already turned violet. She lay sprawled on the bank, her hair plastered across her face, her throat burning. A man knelt beside her, dripping river water. The brim of his hat shadowed a face drawn sharp by sun and time. "You aiming to drown, ma'am?" His voice was rough, as if unused to asking questions that mattered. Etta blinked at him, unsure whether she was alive or dreaming. "Just aiming to remember," she said at last. The stranger studied her for a heartbeat longer before standing, water cascading off his coat. His horse waited a few paces away, snorting steam into the evening. He offered no name, no lecture, only extended a hand to help her sit. When she tried to thank him, her voice splintered. He shrugged. "Don't need thanks. Just seemed wrong to let the river take another." And then he was gone, mounting up, the sound of hoofs swallowed by the hush of reeds. By morning, Siltwater Bend already knew. It began with the washerwomen who spotted a torn ribbon caught on a branch. By midday, every porch had its version, the widow found half drowned in the river, rescued by a stranger with no past. By supper, tongues had turned the tale to scandal. The men laughed low, the women clucked their tongues. Etta walked through town with her head high, each whisper slicing her skin a little thinner. At the mercantile, she felt the hush fall as soon as she entered. At the post office, the clerk refused to meet her eyes. Even the preacher's wife, who once brought her soup after the funeral, crossed the street. By evening she locked her door and drew the curtains. In the silence that followed, she wept not for the river but for the kindness that had drowned first. Calder Boone, that was the name she learned days later, was the man who pulled her from the current. A drifter, folks said. Worked cattle up north, fought in a war that left him quieter than before. He stayed in town because the innkeeper, Miriam Holt, was too kind-hearted to turn him away. Every night he slept in the attic above the saloon, every morning he walked the main street as if searching for something he'd lost. Etta told herself she wanted nothing to do with him. Yet she caught herself listening for the slow rhythm of his boots on the boardwalk, the faint creak of his saddle when he passed her gate. One afternoon he appeared at her door, hat in hand, dust on his coat. The sun behind him turned the air to gold. "Found this near the river," he said, holding out a small silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph of her husband, edges rusted from the water. She hesitated before taking it. "You could have left it," she murmured. "Could have," he said simply. The silence between them stretched, taut and fragile. Wind stirred the curtains behind her, carrying the smell of lavender soap and ash. Finally, she said, "They'll think worse of me now." He met her gaze, eyes the color of worn leather. Let 'em. They've thought worse for less. It wasn't comfort, exactly, but something steadier. Something that didn't flinch. She wanted to invite him in, to pour tea, to thank him properly, but the words wouldn't form. The town's shadow still lay heavy on her doorstep. He seemed to sense it and stepped back, tipping his hat. "Take care by the water," he said. "It remembers what it takes." And then he was walking away, long strides carrying him down the dirt road until the light folded around him. Etta watched from the porch until he disappeared behind the cottonwoods. In the quiet that followed, she heard the faint chorus of the river beyond her field, the same rhythm that had almost claimed her. Yet tonight, it sounded different, less like a threat, more like a question waiting for its answer. She traced the locket's curve in her palm. The metal still smelled faintly of rain and horse leather, a reminder of the man who'd touched it last. For the first time in months, she felt the smallest flicker of warmth beneath her ribs, as though a single coal of her former self had survived the drowning. Night crept over Siltwater Bend, and lamps winked out one by one. From the hills came the low hum of a guitar, soft, uncertain, like someone trying to remember a song. She couldn't be sure if it was him, or only her longing giving sound to silence. Either way, she stayed by the window until the stars blurred, watching the horizon breathe. The town slept. The river waited. And somewhere between them, her heart began to stir, restless for something unnamed, something that felt almost like living again. The storm came first as a rumor, a low moan across the prairie, a shift in the light that made the air taste of iron. By dusk the clouds had gathered like a dark congregation above the valley, and Siltwater Bend seemed to hold its breath. The townsfolk hurried to shutter windows, to tie down porch signs and whisper that the river would rise again before dawn. Etta Marlowe watched from her small kitchen, her fingers tight around the rim of a chipped mug, the scent of rain already drifting through the cracks in the door. She thought of Calder Boone riding the outer fields that morning, his figure a moving shadow against the open plain. She hadn't seen him since the day he returned her locket, though his name hung in the back of her mind like a verse she couldn't forget. Now, as thunder rolled closer, she told herself he'd find shelter somewhere safe, somewhere that wasn't her doorstep. But the thought came with a strange ache, a quiet betrayal of her own resolve. The first drops fell fat and cold, marking the earth in dark blooms. The wind turned wild, and the trees bowed under its voice. She was drawing the final bolt across the door when a knock sounded, a sharp, urgent rhythm. For a moment she thought it was the storm itself, but then came his voice, low and strained. "Mrs. Marlowe, it's Boone. The river's climbing faster than it should. You need to move uphill." She hesitated only long enough to feel her pulse hammer once, twice. Then she pulled the door open. He stood soaked to the bone, rain running in thin streams from his hat brim, his eyes narrowed against the downpour. Behind him, the world was silver and furious. "You shouldn't be out in this," she said. "Neither should you." Lightning flared, showing the river spilling its banks beyond the cottonwoods. The current was swollen, thick with debris. Etta felt the old terror rise in her chest, but he was already stepping inside, pulling the door shut against the wind. His coat dripped onto the floorboards, his breath came hard. The small house felt suddenly too close, too alive. "I told myself I'd warn you and leave," he said, voice roughened by rain. "But that water's meaner than last year's. We waited out here." She nodded, though every muscle wanted to tremble. He set his hat aside, glanced at the trembling walls, then at her. Something in his gaze, steady, unjudging, quieted the noise inside her head. "I'll keep the fire going," he said. "You gather what you need if we have to move." When the thunder cracked again, it seemed to split the sky in two. Etta found herself moving without thought, closing shutters, laying towels against the door seam. The storm made the air thick with the smell of pine smoke and fear. Calder fed the fire until it glowed a fierce orange, its light carving his profile into planes of shadow and gold. Hours seemed to stretch without measure. They sat in the dim glow, the sound of rain loud as applause on the roof. Words came slow, like stones rolled by water. "I never thanked you proper," she said finally. He looked toward her, eyes soft in the firelight. "Didn't need thanks." "I did," she said. "Not just for pulling me out. For not asking why I was there." He turned a poker in the embers. "Figured a person drowns for 100 reasons. None of them need naming." The honesty in it unsettled her. The wind rattled the windows, and for a heartbeat she imagined that if she looked outside, she'd see her own reflection moving in the black water. When a gust forced the door ajar, Calder rose to brace it. Rain sprayed across the floor, darkening the wood. She moved beside him, shoulder to shoulder, pushing against the storm until the latch caught again. The sudden nearness left her breathless. The heat of him, the smell of rain and horse leather, it all blurred with the sound of her pulse. He stepped back, and the air between them trembled. She met his gaze and said, almost without thinking, "Will you stay if I undress?" The words hung there, fragile as glass. He froze, not from offense, but surprise. She shook her head before he could answer. "Not what you think," she said softly. "I'm tired of carrying ghosts on my skin. I just need to be rid of them." He looked at her for a long, uncertain moment, then gave a small nod and turned his face toward the fire. "You do what you need to." Her fingers trembled as she peeled the wet dress from her shoulders. It fell heavy to the floor, dark as a shed memory. The fire threw ribbons of light over her skin, over the bruises time had left in invisible shades. She wrapped a blanket around herself and sat across from him. He never looked away from the flames, as though his restraint itself was an act of reverence. Outside, the storm howled its fury. Inside, there was only the crackle of wood and the measured rhythm of two people still breathing. She spoke first, her voice no louder than the rain. "I used to think grief was a thing you carried. Now I think it's a room you never leave." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes all you can do is open the window and let the weather in." A long silence followed, soft and strange. The tension between them eased, not gone, but transformed into something tender, something clean. He reached forward, laid another log on the fire, and for the first time she saw his hands shake. "Lost someone too?" she asked. He nodded once. "Brothers in arms. A woman once. A home that wouldn't have me back." The confession landed with the quiet weight of truth. Etta drew the blanket tighter. "Then maybe that makes us kin." He gave a crooked smile. Kin or ghosts that finally found the same storm. When dawn came, it arrived slow and pale, filtering through a break in the clouds. The river had swollen but spared the house. Outside, the land steamed with new light. Calder stepped onto the porch, boots sinking into the wet earth. Etta followed, the blanket around her shoulders, her hair unpinned and shining. They stood side by side, watching mist lift from the water. In the distance, a rooster crowed, thin and uncertain. "You'll be leaving," she said quietly. He adjusted the saddle on his horse, eyes tracing the horizon. "Drifters always do. But I reckon some places don't let you leave easy." She smiled, small but real. "Then maybe stay until the mud dries." He didn't answer, only touched the brim of his hat and held her gaze long enough to make the morning feel new. As he rode toward town, Etta turned back to the river. Its surface was calm now, mirroring the pale sky. For the first time, she didn't see loss there. She saw movement, steady, endless, forgiving. The sound of hooves faded behind her, and the world breathed again. Somewhere beyond sight, the storm was still rolling east, carrying with it everything that needed letting go.